What to do about corruption? This is a graph that, that has graphed out, if you will, responses from officials in 62 countries when they were asked, officials meaning government civil servants now, those who oftentimes are part of the problem, as I've explained, questions to them about what to do about corruption. This is the percentage of respondents then who responded based on these different issues here. And I'll step out of the frame. Is what they felt should have the highest rating, meaning what would be the most effective in terms of taming or getting rid of corruption in their country. So interestingly, the first one was simply anti-corruption watchdog institutions. So that's the public voice issue again we talked about in the previous slide. The idea that you have groups in the country, often NGOs, who are there, their job is to raise the question, say, hello, wait a minute, why is this particular bribe being paid? Why is this company getting this benefit over this other company? Why is the president hiring his sisters and brothers to be the ministers in the government? Now, I'm exaggerating to make a point. In countries where that may happen, in those situations, watchdog institutions may not even exist. But the point is that it is useful when they do exist because they can be a voice of reason from the community, simply asking questions of the authorities. But interestingly, government officials have put this as fairly low. Next comes privatization. Now, privatization is meant here in the sense of privatizing government services. So the idea being that they will become more accountable when, let's say, the post office or the national airline is not run by the government, but is run as a commercial business, run as a for-profit organization. It therefore opens it up and makes it more effective, hopefully more efficient, and more cost-effective in particular. So that's slightly more. Then democracy and civil rights, or civil liberties, I mean, simply having a democratic society and having a recognition of civil liberties within that society. Reforming the tax regime. In many of these countries, of course, tax levels and rates and such may exist on the books, but they may rarely be actually collected. This is a key problem, where many governments simply do not have a mechanism whereby they can force people to pay taxes. So that would be the issue of reforming the tax regime, having reasonable rates, but also having a system whereby everyone pays. Budget transparency. This is transparency overall now, but the issue that you have a budget in the government and everyone knows what it's to be used for. It's been agreed and discussed in the parliament or in the legislative branch, typically in a democracy, and that it's public information. One, where the money's coming from that runs the government, and two, where it's going, and that it's all known and understood for those who are interested in knowing. They put slightly higher value on that concept. And then deregulating the economy. This is the burden of regulation again that you find in many countries where they are overly regulated in their economies and in their society for reasons that have nothing to do with public safety or good investment practices and that. It's simply for reasons of corruption. And more deregulation can provide more for a freer public and private sector both to work. And then getting higher now is implementing penalties for corruption. And this is a very key aspect. It's very interesting that this is as high up as it is. Over 80% of the respondents, and remember, these are government civil servants themselves in countries where they experience this type of thing every day. And they're saying if we're really serious about dealing with this, implement penalties. Make it something that you will pay for with your own liberty, for example, if there's a legal system working where you can get tried. And there are obviously laws oftentimes against corruption which can be on the books and not enforced, but enforce them, have penalties, make examples of people, show that you're going to be different. You, the new leader, the new head of state coming into your country, make a point that that's not how we're going to continue here, and enforce the laws that you have. And that ties very much into the next one, which is here on the far right, example by leadership. And look at, that's almost equal to the implement penalties for corruption, is setting an example. This is a very powerful message for those who are in positions of influence, elected officials, monarchs, anyone who is in a key position of authority, where they set an example in these societies that this is not how they're going to function. Let me give you an example. In one country where I lived with my family, the lights were off one day. We didn't have any power. That was actually pretty common. But the brownouts, as they call them, the lights being out, it went on for longer than usual, like a couple days. And I was in the office one day, and I talked to one of my admin staff saying, you know, we have a problem in our neighborhood. We don't have power and this and that. And again, it wasn't uncommon, but it didn't seem to be the time of year where they should have gone on for quite so long. And the staff member said to me, well, actually, we've checked, and in your neighborhood, the power's fine. It's just your house. I said, okay. And what does that mean? He said, well, what it means is that you haven't paid backsheesh for this last couple months to the company. You've been paying your bills, which we had, but you haven't been paying that little extra, and it's coming up to the holiday season. And so these civil servants who are running the electrical power, this is what happens, is they get a little extra. I said, well, wait a minute. I'm paying my bills, and I'm doing everything I should do, but my power is being turned off because I'm supposed to know that I have to go to the power company and grease a few palms, give a little extra money. I said, yeah, that's basically it. I said, well, okay. And meanwhile, I'm a UN official. I'm head of a program in this country. And clearly, based on everything I've just said, you can well imagine that we are probably the last ones that would pay bribes for anything, because we're constantly preaching, as I am now, on and on about how corruption is a bad thing and all the reasons that I've explained. And this is the leadership issue again, where I had my senior admin staff member go to the power company and say, right, we know what you've done, and this is kind of the cost of doing business, but you realize that you've turned off the power of the head of the WFP in this city, and you know, it will be a cold day somewhere before he will pay that. And this is not correct. And it was an opportunity for our staff to have this discussion with the power company people. And they said, oh yeah. So now many of you may think, well, that person was at risk and they shouldn't have done that. And well, no, really, because everyone just kind of does it and it just happens, and it was a random thing. And they didn't think twice, and they turned the power back on, and that was it. Now, at the time, in the family, we were thinking, oh, this is ridiculous. Just pay the backsheesh and be done. But no, at times it is easier to pay the bribe, and that's exactly the point. But when you do pay the bribe just because it's easier, you're not helping the situation, especially when you're in a position of power, of leadership, of authority. You need to exert that leadership, and people notice that you're trying to set a standard, and that is a standard that will not be broken. And this is the same for whether you're a politician, whether you're a government official, a UN official, an NGO official, for all of us. And those disenfranchised, the hungry poor, those who we're talking about in this course, they look up to this. They notice. People see when that happens, that someone is willing to stand up. I've just been preaching about the importance of leadership, and in issues of corruption, where you need to take a stand. And some of you, I know, are thinking, well, you know, that's easy for that UN official guy. You know, he's got the nice car, and he lives in a nice neighborhood, and he can, if it doesn't work and he gets kicked out of that country, he can always go home. Fine. But you're in a very privileged position, and you can get away with that. You can get away with having attitude and saying to folks, no, we're not doing this. Well, I want to give you an example of, and yes, if those of you who are thinking that way, that is to an extent also true, in that we can afford to be difficult and have attitude and question the system. But please don't forget what I'm saying about the issue of leadership again. Because within communities that we work, they know what's right. You know, people are people. People know what is fundamentally wrong and what is fundamentally right. I don't care where you are, what country you're in, what social class, religion, whatever. People fundamentally know. And they will look to us, who are there supposedly to help, for leadership and for taking a stand. But I don't want for the moment to give you the impression that it's only us, the special diplomats, aid workers here and that who come in and out. Poor people, those who we are also there to work with and to advocate for, also do it themselves. And this is an example of a group called the Fifth Pillar. The Fifth Pillar is a group based in India, and they came up with an idea to empower the poorest. That example that I was giving before about bakshish and the power being turned off at our house, well, very similar example happened in India, in a small Indian village where the power guy, the one who manages the power, turning the power on in that village, came by and the power was all turned off. And this is a poor, destitute village in the middle of nowhere. And this group called Fifth Pillar in India had been experimenting and thought they would try out this idea of embarrassing, if you will, making lose face in an Asian context, this official, and to see how that would work. And in a way, it was a very risky proposition, but they had piloted this before, and they found that it could work. So the way it worked was that one of the poor women handed this 0 rupee note to the power official. Now, if you look at that carefully, you can see that it looks like a Indian 10 rupee note. And let me put on a real Indian 10 rupee note just to show you the difference. It's very similar. The founder of the country, Mahatma Gandhi, is there. 10 rupees, that's the Indian 10 rupee note. It's worth just a few cents in US dollars, so it's not a large amount of bribe, but this is the bribe that would otherwise be paid, and that woman was then going to be giving to that power official who was going around to get the electricity turned back on. He was collecting basically 10 rupee notes. So instead of handing him this 10 rupee note, she handed him this one, which is the 0 rupee note. And look carefully what it says. It's the same design as the Indian 10 rupee note, but it says, eliminate corruption at all levels, 0 rupees. I promise to neither accept nor give a bribe. Right there. Now, picture yourself as the electricity, the power official at this village, and you're going around and you're receiving all these 10 rupees notes from everyone, and this is just a normal day. This is just normally how it happens. She hands him this. He takes a look. Now, she has just made him lose face. That's a risk. But she's also put him on notice. Now, look at the power structure here. He is an official with a regular salary, working for a public utility, and then there's this poor, destitute lady. Typically, she would hand him the bill, and she wouldn't even look in his eyes. But she hands him this to his face. He looks at it. She is putting him on notice that she knows that he knows that she knows that he knows that this is not on, and that this has to stop, and it stops with me now. Now stay with me here. This sounds like a very basic premise, and you'd think, oh my gosh, this lady, he wouldn't turn the power on. What happened in this case, and this is how the Fifth Pillar people knew they were onto something, is that this official was so flustered because no one had ever done this to him before. Again, this type of corruption that I'm talking about in this class, folks, is epidemic. It is just a way of life for so many people. To be called on it is what's so unusual. This guy was so flustered, he proceeded to give back all the other 10 rupee notes that he'd gotten from everyone else in the village. He ran back to his truck, and they drove off wherever and turned the power back on and never came back again. Done. These folks were amazed. And they thought, we're onto something. It works. You can go on to the website, fifthpillar.org. They have produced these bills, actually for all countries around the world, and you can even find a US dollar the same. So they're exactly the same format as the currency in the particular countries, but they're slightly altered to say zero on them. The idea that zero bakshish or zero bribe is to be paid. That's a long-winded example of how it works, but it's people taking a stand in situations where no one expects them to, for lots of reasons of power and status. It's breaking that mold. That in particular is how this change will come. This is a fairly dense slide on strategies for achieving good government and anti-corruption success. It's a review of a number of the issues that I've already touched on. One up in the upper left-hand corner, checks and balances, having an independent and effective judiciary. You can take a look at this slide on your own time and study it in some detail. It's quite useful, I think, to look at these key basic needs and requirements to achieve a good and a clean government with no or lack of or minimize corruption. The accountability of political leadership, transparency in party financing, asset declaration for politicians. And again, many of you may think this is sort of standard procedure because as politicians do it in the US and many first world countries. But this is not necessarily what happens in all countries around the world. The important issue of civil society oversight that I've mentioned, the freedom of information, people simply being aware of what is happening and who's making what decisions, budgetary in particular, the monitoring by media and NGOs, the watchdog institutions, anti-corruption watchdog institutions, for example. Having simplified regulations. Keep in mind again that all regulation is not always for a good thing. Much of it can actually be a barrier, purposely a barrier to progress, to good, solid investment, to economic development in countries. And the barriers there that are implemented are simply a way of earning more money, again, on the supply side of corruption. And then in public administration and public finance, having a meritocratic civil service. Now, you may wonder what I'm on about in that particular point. That is a civil service that is hired and then promoted within the system based on results, based on their abilities, based on their potential, not based on who they know and who they may have paid off bribes to in order to get that job or even keep that job. And then a transparent and adequate remuneration. And this is a very key issue that comes up time and time again. I have been posted in a number of countries around the world where, as the senior official for my agency, called the country director in most cases, I would be the one responsible for the international staff in my office, for the local staff, and for the budget and the programs of what we were doing in that country. So I would typically meet with the prime minister or the head of state, the foreign minister, ministers of agriculture, health, education, depending on the particular sector. And in all cases, many of these countries, not just the ones where I was posted, my UN driver who had just dropped me off at this meeting was making easily double what the prime minister is making in terms of salary. This is the problem, is that in most of these countries, the senior officials in the government who you are working with, who you are holding accountable and responsible for the agreements, the implementation of these various programs, that we're talking about here. You're holding them accountable, but they are not making a living wage. This is very, very common. I would find that many of the government staff, counterpart staff, for my staff, when they're out in the field implementing particular programs, and my staff are involved in the evaluation and monitoring of the various activities, the salaries that they would earn on the government side would be what we would pay the gardener back at the house. And again, those would be good, decent salaries for the gardener, but they would not be living wages for a government official. And for senior government officials in particular, what happens in many, many developing countries around the world is the fact that that individual is in that senior position is something that he or she aspires to as an opportunity for his or her entire village or clan or province. This is how it works. So the one person has the job, but they're financially responsible for perhaps hundreds of people back in the village, in their family, in their community. It's different in every case. So he or she may owe many of the same people and others to have gotten that job. He or she may have paid a lot of money, bakshish again, serious corruption, may have paid a lot of money to certain decision makers in the political arena for that job. And the understanding is once you pay enough to get into that particular job, now you've got to pay to keep it. And you've got to keep everyone happy who got you there. And you have to also maintain a lifestyle. So as a minister in the government, you have a car, you have a driver. Now that may be supplied by the government. Maybe you even have a house that they've given you. But you don't have any spending money. You have to entertain. I'm going into this level of detail because until there are good, solid living wages paid to government officials in these countries, we shouldn't be surprised that what happens is they will use these positions that they have for opportunities to look after their own community, and they will have what we call income generating opportunities outside the office. Now an extreme example would be a government official who works during the day and drives a cab at night. Now that's not corruption necessarily. Obviously that's something that person is doing simply to earn extra money. Now, many civil servants in some governments are not allowed to moonlight, as we call it. They're not allowed to have other jobs. But those particular jobs, taxi driving is not the type of corruption that we're talking about. What we're talking about is when ministers in governments make decisions about economic investments, let's say, where X country or X company is given permission to build this or to exploit that in that country in return for any amount of money, and we're talking often huge amounts of money. This is the kind of major institutionalized corruption that we're talking about. But we shouldn't be surprised when it does happen because of the fact that the vast majority of civil servants in these governments are not making a living wage to begin with.